33 of A Discovery of Witches. Listeners, I'm going to apologize to you straight out. We are recording this episode just as my household has been struck with some variety of the plague. And so my voice is going to be a little crackly. I may sniffle more than usual, but I promise I'm 100% here in heart, body, and mind for the end of A Discovery of Witches and moving us into Act 3.
Yes. It's just going to have to be what it is today. And it will be fine, and you'll be delightful and brilliant as always, I'm sure.
I'm satisfied that even the flu cannot dull my brilliance, but we're going to see about that, and I invite you all to comment on it. In any case, our chapter breakdown is as follows. When we get to the beginning of chapter 31, Diana is still at the bottom of the oubliette with Stephen and Rebecca's ghosts. We discover that Stephen and Rebecca have been telling Diana stories to try and keep her safe and to tell her what she needs to do to escape this life or death situation. She imagines a silver ribbon winding around herself, and she flies up to Matthew, who is waiting for her at the top of the oubliette. Matthew and Baldwin take her home to Septour, where Mart and Isabeau and Matthew tend to her. We discover that Diana has been repeatedly tortured by Satu and that she's suffering from a number of injuries, many of the physical, most of them emotional and mental. Matthew and Isabeau and Mart manage to get Diana undressed, at which point we discover that Satu has marked Diana with Matthew's seal on her back. And as they treat her, she essentially loses consciousness and is told that she will be whisked away to New York because Matthew and Isabeau have decided that if they as vampires cannot keep Diana safe, then the best thing to do is to send her home to the witches. And so in chapter 32, we are introduced to one of my favorite characters in the entire book series, which is the Bishop House. And the Bishop House is important enough to be a character in and of itself. So we get to the Bishop House, and it is an unusual and interesting place. We meet Tabitha. We have our first face-to-face confrontation with M and Sarah, who both assist Matthew in healing Diana, and then we have some conversations about Stephen and Rebecca and the marking and Diana's trauma. Diana almost summons Witchfire against Sarah because Sarah threatens Matthew. And then in chapter 33, Diana is floating in and out of consciousness. We get a bit more discussion about her spellbinding. Diana goes into the woods to deal with the fact that her parents have essentially left her bound and defenseless, and she believes it's because she is dangerous. Matthew convinces her it's because they were actually afraid of the congregation. And then Matthew and Diana engage in some magical acrobatics in the woods, and we get the first real taste of what it might be like if Diana simply embraced her power. We end the chapter with family dinner at the Bishop's and some naughty reconnecting time in Diana's parents' old bedroom with shooting stars. Finn.
And really what we get to do in chapter 31 and 32 and 33 is finish up and close off the cliffhanger that we had to leave you all with there at the end of chapter 30. And then we move into Act 3 of the book, and we go to New York, which is really exciting. And we finally get to meet these characters that we've been hearing about this whole time, but have never laid eyes on as yet in the book. So did we want to finish up our heartbreaking discussion of Rebecca and Stephen and Diana in the oubliette? I have a question to start off with, actually.
Certainly.
What do you think about this portrayal of Diana, and it occurs in chapter 30 as well, this portrayal of her regressing to her 7-year-old self? And what do you think of that?
What do I make of it, or whether I like it?
Both.
So I think that it is more effective in the text, actually, than it is in the audiobook. I think that the audiobook is a bit disconcerting, but there is a part of me that, given how wounded Diana is and has been by her parents' death, I think there's a very real sense in which the character of Diana is actually frozen in those moments that she spent with her parents. And so it doesn't strike any unusual notes for me for her in this moment of extraordinary terror and helplessness to be reduced emotionally and mentally to her 7-year-old self. I also think that it's an effective conduit for dealing with Stephen and Rebecca in a way that doesn't leave Diana being exceptionally confrontational towards them, if that makes any sense. Because I think that, especially with the revelations that we have in these chapters, there is a version of this book where the adult Diana is not listening to Stephen and Rebecca, she's fighting with them. And so I think that the 7-year-old Diana device is an effective choice for me. What about for you?
Yeah, I like it a lot as well. And it really strikes me as just like another version of Diana running away, as she has frequently done. And as we have frequently noted, running away from her present and whatever her present problems happen to be. And her running away to her 7-year-old self because she has seen Rebecca and Stephen. And so that sort of seems to me to be the automatic emotional response to seeing them, going back to a time when they were alive and they had this connection.
Well, I also see this, in the classic sort of 3-act structure with 7 anchor scenes, the inciting incident, the choice to engage, the midpoint reversal, no way out but through, a darkest moment, a climax, and then conclusion and resolution. I see this entire set of chapters as the no way out but through. And the short version of that structural conversation is to say that in most traditional 3-act structures, there are these 7 anchor scenes. The inciting incident is what launches our conflict into action. The second anchor scene is the choice to engage, where the protagonist chooses to engage with the actions of the antagonist and becomes involved in the conflict. That's the transition from Act 1 to Act 2. Then we have the midpoint reversal, where we recontextualize the conflict, where we have to reconsider the danger and the power of the antagonist. We already talked about that being the moment either theoretically when we meet Domenico or when Diana is actually kidnapped, followed by anchor scene 4, No Way Out But Through, where the protagonist not only continues to make a choice to engage with the conflict, but the stakes are high and there's no real surety of success. That moves us from Act 2 into Act 3. And I think that this arc of about 6 chapters is what takes us there. And the No Way Out But Through concept, meaning that Diana has to, in order to survive, she has to realize that her old methods of problem solving and of getting through difficult points in her life will no longer work. And so this retreat to the 7-year-old self and then the ghosts actually pushing her to turn around, to wake up, to do what she's meant to do is actually very effective for me as a transition, both structurally and emotionally.
Yeah, and I think really like the quote in the book that pretty much sums up what you just said is Diana saying, "Can't we skip the bad parts?" And Rebecca saying, "Well, it doesn't work that way. You can't just skip the bad parts of the story." And that is in, this story that she's telling Diana, but also obviously in the larger context of the story that we're reading and Diana's life. So
I think it's also remarkably resonant for her relationship with Matthew, and that when we get to the best of Diana and Matthew, it is both of them embracing the best and worst parts of themselves, but it means that she can neither turn away from the bad parts where other witches are going to be hunting her, etc., but she also can't turn away from the parts of Matthew that are distasteful or violent or not what she imagined. Like the fairy tale prince is a convenient device for a 7-year-old, but it's not the way that a 30-something-year-old human being in the world can live.
Right. And clearly Rebecca and Stephen were aware of that because they tell her that she can't hide from him and that he's the one that they have been waiting for. So confirming all the things that we have talked about previously on the podcast. We have like her parents literally saying like, "No, he's the prince. Like he's the one that we have been waiting for you, and you can't hide from him." So, and really all of this is to stay in this whole story that Rebecca and Stephen, Rebecca primarily constructed for her, really, if you think about it, is evidence of what an incredible witch Rebecca was and what an incredible seer, that she didn't just have premonitions, but she literally saw like every single part of Diana's life in this conflict and was able to construct a story that would relate to a 7-year-old to tell her all about it.
And I wonder, in that first glimpse that we get of Rebecca back in the very first chapter where Diana is talking about her, I wonder if some of those moments where Rebecca was consumed by wraiths, in the scrying glass, and the moments where the magic took hold of her, I'm wondering if this is not the kind of thing that she was seeing, and that's why she was so paralyzed. And I think that one of the more remarkable things about this arc of 6 chapters is how immediate they make Rebecca and Stephen feel, even though they have been absent and we haven't really heard from them, and they haven't been active in the story until this point, and also how fully they spring to life on the page. Rebecca is palpable from the moment that she appears in the oubliette, and so is Stephen. I had a question on page 391 when the text says, "My mother's smile was bittersweet. Yes, Diana. She gave my father a long look, the kind that children don't understand until they're older." What perspective do you think we're coming from there? Do you think that that is kind of an omniscient narrator type comment, or is that coming from Diana? And if so, when? Because I don't think that she has like the emotional wherewithal to be making that comment now.
Yeah. Well, since I'm of the opinion that future Diana is telling the story, I'm going to say that it's future Diana interpreting that look. While currently in the story, she does not have that emotional presence to say that. I'm going to say it's future her interpreting their look, that, you know, when she says, "Oh, they lived happily ever after," and her parents are like, "Sure they did."
Isn't it happy to think so?
Of course they did. And I just want to say, just as far as writing craft goes, 31 is still really, like 31, 32, and 33, comparing them with the previous block, which we said was just like excellent and we both love it. And 31, 32, and 33 continue to be like fairly excellent, and there's very few wasted parts in it. But I just love in the beginning of 31, just having just the tiniest touch and light touch of levity in the background, where we have the monk crossing himself every time they talk about witches, the ghost monk in the background. And I just like love it so much.
And what's remarkable also in these chapters is that levity is back there. And I think that it shows a great deal more confidence and more of a settling into the voice that these novels will eventually take than the preceding 30 chapters have had. Because one of the things I love, especially as we get into Book of Life, is that there are these like little flickers of levity that are organic and that are not forced and just come out of I think really excellent authorial craft. But this is the first time I think that we really get that a lot, or that we get some relief from the heartbreaking nature of these couple chapters.
Speaking of which, and before we rescue Diana, I would like to ask, so we have this event with Diana in the oubliette and her being kidnapped, broken apart by the chapter in the middle from Matthew's perspective. And we talked about previously in the beginning of the book how for me it was difficult to split up Diana's perspective and insert Matthew's perspective in there. And I think now that is because in the beginning of the book, it doesn't do anything to the tension for me, whereas this is like a real-time telling of what's happening. And what it does is it really like cranks the tension up, because it leaves you in this moment and it just leaves Diana in the oubliette there, and we jump to Matthew and we like see everything Matthew's doing. So we're getting this real-time back and forth between the two of them. And I think it functions much better in the story than in previous instances. What do you think about it?
I agree with you, because as I was thinking about where to put it, first is consistent with my theory that we really, at least in this book, only get Matthew's perspective when Diana is unconscious. And that's true of the Baldwin and Matthew chapter, where we leave Diana because she's basically drifted off to sleep after being tortured, or she's passed out, however you medically want to cope with that. And then we have Baldwin and Matthew, and then we have the realization of where she is and that Matthew is on the way. So it serves the tension in a certain way, because we know that Matthew has a limited amount of time, but at least that he's on the way. And then the question is like, is he too late, and is there anything that Matthew can't overcome? And as it turns out, like, the oubliette is it, right? And I think that the oubliette is so beautifully metaphorical for both Diana's relationship with herself and for Matthew's relationship with Diana, in the sense that Matthew goes charging into this situation to save her, but really she can only save herself. She can only get through this and get to where she wants to be if she wakes up and accepts herself and embraces herself and pulls herself out of it, which I think is really lovely. And bopping into Matthew's perspective doesn't bother me as much. One, because Diana's unconscious. Two, because I think that you need a little bit of a break from the emotion of being in Diana's perspective with Stephen and Rebecca. And also because I think if you were to flip it, it would be really strange for Matthew to show up here. Like, the only way that I could maybe see you doing it is moving this portion where Diana's still with Stephen and Rebecca to like earlier in 29, and then you do Matthew and Baldwin all the way up to when you get to the oubliette and then switch back to Diana in a new chapter. But I don't know that I like that as much. So that's a long way of saying I think I like it. I think I like it.
No, I think this works much better. Yes. Yeah, I like it a lot. So we have Matthew and Baldwin. We have their timelines crashing together. Matthew and Baldwin show up on the scene just as Rebecca's finishing the story.
I just had a question about page 392 when Stephen says, magic is in the heart, Diana. My father said, don't forget. What is he talking about?
I think it's a little bit of what we've talked about previously, which is that magic is based in instinct, and that Diana's magic, particularly, even when she was not aware she was doing it, she was instinctually doing it. And also perhaps tying it a bit to Matthew, that her magic is, strongly influenced by Matthew, at least at this point.
I think it's that, but I also think from Stephen and Rebecca's perspective that one of the broader themes and one of the broader things he's telling his daughter is that love is the magic. That is the place where the strongest magic lives, whether it's the magic that saves your life, whether it's the magic that protects your child, whether it's the magic that creates a family, the magic that keeps you going another day. I think that it's more about resilience and family, and especially coming from Stephen and Rebecca in the afterlife after they've made this incredible, heartbreaking, soul-wrecking sacrifice in the name of their child, going and knowing that they would be ripped apart, basically, to protect her is an extraordinary statement. And it's dealt with a remarkable amount of lightness. We just do it and we walk away from it. But I think that, for me at least, that sentiment and that theme is redolent throughout this book, and especially once we get to Book of Life.
It calls back quite a lot to Harry Potter for me at several moments, especially particularly in these 3 chapters, and we'll get to those in the other times in a second. But it's very much, spoilers for Harry Potter, I guess, that love is the strongest spell, basically, which is what we get in Harry Potter.
You were talking about Diana and Baldwin, and I interrupted you. I apologize.
Well, I was talking about Diana rescuing herself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then talk about Diana rescuing herself.
Yeah. So Matthew and Baldwin show up on the scene, and Diana has to figure out how to fly. They show up right as Rebecca finishes her story, basically, and Diana has to figure out how to fly. And Rebecca, or the ghost of Rebecca, has essentially given her the tool to unravel, for lack of a better word, this spellbinding that has happened to her, or begin to unravel it, I should say.
How do you feel about it as a device? Is it a bit too much Deus Ex Machina for you? That Rebecca sort of shows up and gives her the tool that solves the thing?
I don't think so, because I think that we were clued into it in the beginning that Rebecca knew all of this was going to happen. So this is always what was going to happen, for me. So it doesn't feel convenient to me. How does it feel to you?
I think that I agree with you that we've been laying the groundwork for this, and that it's a much better sort of, I wouldn't even say that this is retroactive continuity. I would say that this is more of a reveal, and that we have been building towards this for some time and sort of laying the groundwork. So it doesn't really bother me, but I can imagine a read where somebody doesn't care for it on the basis of the fact that it feels like this just pops out of the ether.
That was the other thing I was going to say. It was about Harry Potter. If I think of it, I'll bring it back up again.
I don't know, but I know it was smart. Does it have to do with ghosts, or does it have to do with lost loved ones coming back to help you, or does it have to do with...
It does. Yes, it does.
Yes!
It does have to do with ghosts and lost loved ones coming back to help you. So I guess, spoilers for Deathly Hallows. It reminds me quite a lot of, particularly in the beginning where Rebecca and Stephen are telling Diana to wake up and, face her life, essentially. Reminds me quite a lot of Harry Potter in Deathly Hallows, where he goes to the grove to be killed and all of his ghostly relatives show up to support him.
All I can think of is, will it hurt? And I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry.
No, don't cry. There's no
crying in baseball, and there's certainly no crying about Harry Potter and an All Souls podcast.
But I definitely may have teared up earlier when I was thinking about it and writing my notes, and I was like, it's just like Harry Potter.
is not to say, I think, that either of us believe that necessarily these elements are borrowed. One of the reasons they are so resonant is because of the universality of them, and the universality of the idea of self-sacrificing parental love, and of being connected to those you have lost despite time, distance, trauma, etc. And that you are your best self, your truest self, your most capable self when you embrace both your success and your failure, your love and your loss, and all of those things, to be whole and to walk unafraid into what faces you.
Right. Yes.
That was a lot. Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yes.
I blame the Theraflu.
Yeah. Shall we go back to set tour?
Not affiliated with Theraflu in any way. Oh, I don't know that I'm ready to be back at Setur. I wanted to talk about the place in 394 where Baldwin is encouraging Matthew to knock Diana out. And Diana and Matthew have this exchange.
I have a note about that as well.
Yeah,
yes.
where
Good,
Diana basically says, like, I will take your blood, but I'm taking it on my own terms. Which I think is a really interesting, like, we get the glimmers of the agency she will eventually display throughout these couple chapters, which is really interesting to me, that we get her basically at her lowest point, at her darkest point so far. And then this is when we begin to show the creature she's capable of becoming.
Yeah. Yes, I do have it noted because of the agency that she displays, but also because I will present it as my argument, my counter argument to the idea that Matthew sedated Diana last time, which we've talked about a little bit when they're on the plane, and whether or not he did or did not give her his blood to sedate her when they're on the plane on the way to the Septors. And the reason it's my counter argument is because Baldwin suggests it. Matthew is surprised. Like, he's like,
and Matthew refuses.
It seems to me that he's reacting in a way that suggests that he's never thought of that before. Like, Baldwin's like, hey, dude, like, do this thing. And Matthew's like, what? Oh, yeah. Like, no. You know? Just the way it reads on the page to me suggests to me that Matthew has never even, like, considered this before. And I'm not sure if it's a retcon, or I'm not sure if it's my counter argument to say, no, he didn't actually do that last time.
I don't know. I'd have to go back and look, because I also wonder, you know, we do have a couple scenes where, like, Matthew bites his lip, or where Matthew draws blood from his own body without realizing it. It's also possible that he just did, you know, in the course of, or, you know, the last time that he spirited her away to France, he had just killed Gillian. There's no saying, there's no indication what it does when a vampire feeds, or, like, you know, if there's any of their own blood that's involved. Who knows? But I think that's a worthy counter argument. I always read it as him just not wanting to admit that he had done it before.
Yeah, no, it reads to me like he just never considered it ever before at all. So we'll leave that to the listeners, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, and his emotional distress through this entire chapter is really, I think, really well communicated, and even better, it is, I think, putting pebbles in the jar for when we later start to talk about some of Matthew's emotional reactions to things, and showing that he is not entirely under control, but that he has some measure of, I don't know what I was going to say. But that being said, like, I think that his anxiety and his frantic concern for her is really well communicated in this chapter. And then we fly in Baldwin's helicopter back to Septor.
How nice to have a helicopter. As you do.
As you do. Yeah, thanks, Baldwin. Thanks, Bess Baldwin. So, and I actually really like Baldwin and Diana's relationship throughout this chapter. I have a note about something that happens at the end of the chapter, but I really like their interactions and how, like, he clearly has distaste for her, but he's also curious about her and also being helpful without, like, too much nonsense. We do get this moment where, like, Matthew, they go back to Septur, they're taking care of Diana and all of her injuries, and Matthew doesn't want to put Diana into the bath because Baldwin will smell the blood, but Baldwin did just ride in a helicopter with them all the way back to Septur, and Diana was bleeding then also. So I'm not sure if I should read that
I
as
just
Matthew's.
think that Matthew's not being rational.
Right. Yes, that's like how I need to read it, because otherwise it makes no sense.
Well, I think that is just how I read it. It's not even how I need to read it. It's when I read.
For me, it's how I need to read it.
Well, but I think that when you put it together with the other parts in the text, right, where he is saying this sort of nonsensical thing on 395, we won't do anything you don't want to do. Number one, that's not true, but I can understand him emotionally needing to say that to her to try and comfort her because he's desperate. The assertion like, I can take care of my wife, Momo. No, not right now you can't. And Isabeau having to coax him and say, you are not helping my child. Like, you are not in a position to think things through. I think that is just that's more evidence for me that when Matthew has this objection to putting her in the bath, that it's really just about his inability to sort of let go of her now that she's been hurt, quote unquote, on his watch. Like, I think part of that is about his own sort of inability to protect guilt, and his own terror at the fact that he's potentially losing her.
And I think somewhere in him he realizes this, because he definitely shifts more into a detached state of like competent Dr. Matthew, which I will compare very similar to in Outlander Claire's duality, where, you know, you have like Nurse Randall, where she's like very competent Nurse Claire, and then you have other Claire. So this is a very similar thing where it is much easier to care for someone if you detach from them emotionally. And having been through family trauma before, I recognize the need to detach and take care of the situation for everybody's sake. So,
well, and especially because Diana can't. You know, Diana is not in an emotional position here to manage herself. And as insistent as she is about knowing what happened in Jerusalem, and is about like taking these moments where she's near death and she's saying, no, if I'm going to be sedated, I will sedate myself. Tell me your secrets. You will keep nothing from me. Like, her ability to stay present here is extraordinary, but she's also, I mean, she's
wildly in shock.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that is most of my notes on 31, because then we go into the lengthy, you know, latter half of the chapter is them caring for her, caring for all of her wounds, you know, this description of all the wounds she have, which, by the way, they're all horrific. And then, you know, the decision to go to New York, where she will be in the hands of witches and therefore more safe from witches than she is with the vampires, which,
Okay, so before we leave chapter 31 to get into the Bishop House, which is one of my favorite things, as I already said, we have one more thing that we'd really like to pull out, and that's on page 399, where Matthew is holding Diana, and he says, "Stay with me, Diana." She says, "Did you have to kill Jillian?" I sobbed. "Yes." His voice was flat and dead. "Why did you let me hear this from someone else? Satu told me you'd been in my rooms, that you were using your blood to drug me. Why, Matthew? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid of losing you. You know so little about me, Diana. Secrecy, the instinct to protect, to kill if I must. This is who I am." What do we think about that?
Which part?
I don't know. All of it?
His answer or the...
Well, I think we can break it out into a couple parts. We can break it out into her choice of timing and his response, the satisfactoriness or the satisfaction or lack thereof that we get from the answer, Diana's satisfaction with the answer, and how they make it about Matthew's fear. What do you think of those things?
I think that his answer for me is semi-satisfactory. Semi. I think, I mean, other than the part that, as we discussed before, everyone seems to dismiss murder in this book. Other than that, I think that it is an honest answer that he's giving, and I think that he regrets not telling her, though I don't know how she would have reacted had he told her prior to this point. And I think her need to ask about it, you know, during this time is just a result of the shock and this kind of like misplaced concern over events. Like when someone is seriously injured or seriously ill, they will become like fixated and upset about something that is like definitely not something they need to be upset about right then. And it's just kind of this like a displaced like fear and concern and anxiety about things that are not actually like pertinent in the moment right now. So I think that's kind of like what is happening there with her asking about it like right now. And I think her problem with it seems to be that he didn't tell her. So again, I have problems with the treatment of murder in this series, and it's one of my hangups. And as I've already stated my opinion of Diana like having this fairly cavalier attitude about it, and I just have to chalk it up to like that's just how things are dealt with in this particular universe. And
yeah, I mean, I think that the part that sort of strikes me is Matthew treating it as an aspect of his own cowardice, which I think is both true and not very satisfying, because I do think that Matthew perceives this need to protect. I think he correctly perceives it as a weakness, and that it has more, I think, to do with his temper and his need to control and everything. He certainly has the perspective to treat that as a weakness, but in comparison with Diana being braver, I'm not sure that I find that to land particularly well. He is beating himself a little bit hard with the "this is who I am" bit, so he's taken out the lash and he's given himself a good self-flagellating moment, which is not
good flogging.
It's certainly one of Matthew's worst traits. I'm not particularly pleased for Diana that she just skims over it, but at the same time, she is in shock, deeply traumatized, and hurt. And so
she is traumatized.
That's the only way that I can sort of scoot past it. I wish that later, more composed Diana took a moment to confront it better. But I think that she does a significantly better job of that in other places in the series than she does with Jillian. I think that Jillian is just a missed opportunity for Matthew and Diana, and like one of those things that you just have to say, well, that was crap, and move on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. And move on we do. And before we move into chapter 32 and we get to New York, I just love, in the background when they're, Diane is asking at the very end of the chapter if Septours will be okay once they leave, if anyone's in danger. And Matthew just laughs and says, those two women have been in it and it's fine.
And it's so clear from their relationship and both, and from their bearing that they have. And I love the image of like Isabeau and Mart just watching like the tanks roll in and being like, this is nothing.
Yeah. It's fine. Crusades. It's all fine. Everything is fine. Right.
And, that's another just slight moment of levity where Diana is concerned about something that, of course, she has no way of knowing that that's the case. But, Matthew being like, no, my mom can handle it. She is made of some stern stuff, that Isabeau.
Mm-hmm. And Mart can handle it too. I have no doubt that Mart can take down anybody.
Oh, for sure. I'm sure that Mart has probably fed on most of the invaders, let's be honest.
Well, she does like brawny men, so.
So we get to chapter 32, and we are whisked by virtue of the Declaremont jet back to LaGuardia, where apparently Baldwin is in his element, tapping away at his computers. Before we leave, we have this moment where Baldwin gives Diana some advice, which actually I think
is quite good.
Lands very, very well. And I think that it is in line with what Stephen and Rebecca have been trying to tell her from the bottom of the oubliette. And so I actually like that moment quite a lot.
No, I like it a lot too. And this is, best Baldwin and Diana. And I enjoy their relationship in this book. And I think it's important for her to hear it from somebody who is not as close to her. Because sometimes even we as humans in a non-fictional world have a tendency to ignore the people who are closest to us, and sometimes need to hear things from people that we either loathe or are just not connected with, and have them be like, hey, hey.
Well, and it also, I like that it's a moment of Baldwin recognizing Diana not just as someone who has a relationship with Matthew, but someone who is capable of making choices on her own, and showing her a way where she can make these choices, where she's not bound by the choices that the congregation makes or the ways in which Matthew is trying to shield her. There is another way, and that way is for her to embrace who she is and move forward. So I think that that is actually a really lovely character moment for both of them, and it's important.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, textually, we have that he actually, has a certain amount of respect for Diana in this book. Cannot say the same for Worst Baldwin, but Best Baldwin has respect for Diana. And so he gives her the advice, and then, she says goodbye to him, and he says, that's not how family says goodbye, and I would just like to stick a pin in this whole conversation about family, and him leaning in and smelling her. And we will pin this to our wall. I know we took a pin out last time, but we're putting one in for book 3 this time. It's going to be there for a while, but I would just like to note that in our text. And then we go to the Bishop house.
Squee! Like some pretty unadulterated squeeing, because the Bishop house is not only one of my favorite characters in the book, also one of my favorite settings. And I know that I'm not alone, but I think it's because the Bishop house is like quirky and opinionated and funny, and also like it is a place that I can very easily envision. And I like the idea of the house having its own opinion, like its own spirit, as opposed to the people that live in it. I just really love it.
Yeah, it's fair to say, it's fairly obvious that both of us I love the Bishop house. We both love the Bishop house. I love it throughout the entire series. And this introduction, the first time, for any first time readers, when you get through and they come up to the door and Diana says something along the lines of, or they leave the note about the house getting to know Matthew, and Diana says, oh yeah, the house is, a little complicated and it's been known to be upset at visitors. So, and I was like, wait, what?
Well, I also have a little heart scribbled on page 410 at that note, where a note in Sarah's dark, decisive handwriting was taped to the staircase's newel post. Out. Thought the house needed some time alone with you first. Move slowly. Matthew can stay in M's old room. Your room is ready. There is a postscript in N's rounder scroll. Both of you use your parents' room, which I just
it's so good.
Adore. I absolutely adore. And again, like just such a lightness of hand in capturing both of them in this one moment of like Sarah trying to manage and being a bit thorny, and M being like, you're being ridiculous. I love you, but just I'm going to override you for everyone's sanity.
And I'd say within the space of like 3 pages, we get 5 character introductions. 4 character introductions. We get the house, we get Tabitha, and then we get Sarah and M. Well, I call it 5 because we get the Bishop house ghosts as well, which I would consider to be kind of like collectively a character or several characters that appear and reappear. And I actually for a moment wanted to contrast the Bishop house ghost to the ghosts in the oubliette, and how I think it's a really nice device to have the ghosts in France, in La Pierre, be so like tragic and sad and just like carry this weight with them. And then you go to the Bishop house and it's all the relatives and they're all very sassy and they have a lot of life, even though they are clearly ghosts. Absolutely.
I really, really like that part. I also like that in this chapter, after the oubliette, we see Diana sort of tentatively reaching out with her power and sort of beginning to use it. Earlier in the book, I think that when we talked about it, I can't remember which episode it was, but you asked me the question of whether we think that Diana's reaching out with her power to speak to Matthew or to touch him.
That was when they were at yoga.
Right, and she withdraws from it. And there are a couple other places where she sort of like reaches out and then she backs off. And then this time she leans into it, which I just think is such a lovely sign of growth despite her trauma, that she says, no, this is part of me now and this is part of me and you, and leans into it, which I just think is really pretty.
It's very nice. And is that in reference, are you talking about the chain specifically?
Yes, page 413. Unsure what would make an impression on his preternatural senses, I concentrated on the chain that had unfurled when he'd first kissed me. When I touched it with an imaginary finger, it emitted a low, steady hum. That's what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yes. It is lovely. And I also love, too, we haven't gotten excited and kind of like childlike and relaxed Matthew in quite a while. And I enjoy that he's just like in awe of the Bishop House and all the things, all the magical things. And he's kind of like a kid asking all these questions and kind of just wants to like take everything in. And I enjoy it a lot. And I think it's adorable.
Well, and trying to do his best to, like, woo Diana's family as well. I mean, like, he is trying to make a good impression on Sarah and Em, and Sarah's having none of it.
It's daunting. It's a daunting task to woo Sarah.
So I think that the point where Matthew really begins to charm Sarah and where it's most effective is where he displays his respect for and deference to Sarah's ability to care for Diana. And not only do I really like that as him recognizing that other people can be near her and take care of her and not be a threat to her, but also the fact that he appears to have open and honest respect for Sarah's ability to use her craft, because I get the impression that he's known witches, but maybe he hasn't been around witches, you know? And so this is a really nice moment for both of them. I also love the levity on 416 where Sarah says, I don't imagine he'll get an eye full of anything he hasn't already seen. You aren't hungry, are you? Sarah said without a backward glance. No, Matthew said dryly. I ate on the plane. My aunt's eyes tingled across my neck. So did Em's. Sarah, Em! I was indignant. Just checking. I mean, I think that that's really, really nicely done, and we move away from it so quickly that you only get like this little of laughter before you have to go into Sarah doing the serious business of taking care of Diana and the myriad terrible things that happened to her, while also processing, although sort of somewhat out of frame, the fact that other witches, people like Sarah and Em, did this to Diana.
Yeah, and then we get the reveal after Sarah has taken care of all the other things. We finally get the reveal of the back. Of course, we had Martin, Isabeau, and Matthew looking at Diana's back at Sept tours, but I am of the opinion, and I don't know what everyone else feels about this, that her back was too badly, bruised and damaged for anybody to make out much of anything of what had happened. And now, with Sarah's help, they are actually able to see what in fact has been done to Diana's back, because that has kind of been not a secret, but we've just been hanging on it for a little bit.
This is a difficult scene for me, though. I know that we have to do it, but knowing and feeling from the text how upset and how traumatized and how frightened Diana is that even these people that she loves are behind her and trying to take care of her. It's really heartbreaking to read. And I think it's interesting how we go from this reveal on 419, when I refused to give you up, Satu marked me with your seal, to Matthew basically telling the aunts about the Knights of Lazarus. He apparently just takes in stride the fact that Diana has figured this out, that this is just part of what she knows about him now, which I think is an interesting choice.
Yeah, and I feel like while she was a bit tit for tat in sneaking in his drawers, and she kind of excused it by saying, well, he snuck around in my stuff and therefore it's okay that I sneak around in his stuff. He comes in and he says, well, I did sneak around in your house. And and he's not, I appreciate that he's not upset about it, because I feel like it would be hypocritical for him to be upset about it. But at the same time, we know how I feel about her snooping in his drawers.
True, but we also get a snippet of Best Matthew on 420 when he says, besides, how can I blame you for finding out on your own what I should have told you myself? When he is...
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Best Matthew, right? Where he is acknowledging that his tendency not to tell the whole truth is not only damaging for him, it's damaging for other people, and he cannot be angry at people for discovering things that it was his responsibility to deal with and to present to them. What do we think about the emergence of the Witchfire?
Prior to the Witchfire, do we want to really quickly cap our discussion of Diana as people's property? And that Satu has viewed her as, stated, and we talked about a lot while she's being tortured, this opinion of Diana belonging to people and being the property of people. And now Satu has actually branded her essentially as somebody's property. and how she, now has that physical representation, whether or not she actually at this moment believes herself to be property of anybody, because she is moving more into her best self.
I think that it was going to take someone breaking through Diana's walls in this extremely violent way for Diana to begin to come into herself. And as we talked about in the last episode, certainly that doesn't excuse the trauma. I'm not saying that Diana deserved the trauma, but the best answer is that Diana belongs to herself. And I don't think that she was capable of understanding that if she does not belong to herself and if she doesn't embrace herself, other people will always lay claim to her. I don't think that she ever would have reached that if not for what she undergoes at La Pierre. I think that she would have been content essentially to let Matthew manage her because it was safer, and the Matthew that she initially wants, I think, in this book, luckily, thankfully, is not the Matthew that we have at the end of book 3, but working towards best Matthew and best Diana is when they are emotionally connected but not utterly dependent.
Yeah. Well, she even makes the comment in this reading that she feels managed, whereas previously she has just let herself be managed, and now she is actually like, oh, I'm being managed a bit, and I don't know how I feel about that. I'm not sure that I like that very much. So we are definitely, have textual evidence that she's moving towards a more fuller Diana. And now we can put the Witchfire down. Put the Witchfire down, honey. Which is funny and lovely, but also, yikes.
Yeah, but also, bless her heart, she's just... And especially when she goes to, child Diana while almost wielding the Witchfire, that's part of what makes me have a little bit of difficulty with 33. And that difficulty is not to say that I don't like 33, and I'm talking specifically, listeners and readers, about the part of 33 where Matthew and Diana are in the forest, which we'll get to. But it just feels so soon after La Pierre, and she's clearly, when she's using this Witchfire, so damaged that the idea of Matthew taking her out and being like, well, now's the time to learn to use your magic, seems really reckless and terrible of Matthew. Not best Matthew. Matthew rushing things a lot. And the only way that I can really sort of stomach that as we move into 33 is the idea that Sarah did a great deal more to heal at least Diana's body than she did then. I don't think it's unsupported by the text, but the text does not seem to indicate the extent of Diana's physical healing. But keeping her in bed for hours and then being like, now is the time for Magic 101, doesn't seem best to me.
Right. And she's, just discovered about, spell binding and all of that business when we get into chapter 33. What do you think of the comment that when we get into 33, after Diana wakes up and she's eavesdropping on the grown-ups arguing about her.
To be fair, they are arguing about her very close to her, and she's not entirely awake.
Yes. No. But it has very much the feeling of the grown-ups are talking now and Diana is asleep. And, she wakes up and comes down and she...
But I think that that's also sort of symbolic, right? Is that there are these people who are trying to take care of her, who are talking over her, and she's not participating the same way that she hasn't been participating for the better part of her life in taking care of herself and taking care of some of her basic needs, which involve, being in touch with the witch that she is instead of the non-witch she wants to be. And so, yes, it definitely has that feel for me, but I think that it carries some symbolic weight.
So what I was...
Oh, sorry.
What I was leading to was the comment by M where she says the goddess is present when Witchfire is called. And what do we think about that? And why is that true of this element and not the previous elements that Diana has also had contact with, the other 3? And why is it fire?
I think, I have a spoilery answer for this.
Non-spoilery.
Oh, God.
What do you think about that being the goddess is, because M says that. So M saying the goddess is present with Witchfire, but she doesn't make that statement with the other 3 elements. So
Because witchfire as opposed to ordinary fire, witchfire is irrevocable. That, for me, that is why. It's that you can't heal it, you can't stop it, you can't escape it, you can't do anything with it. And so...
Right. No backsies. No takebacks.
Right. No do-overs, no mulligans. The witchfire, once you let it loose, that is an irrevocable choice. And that is a life or death choice that is very much bound up in my opinion, the balance of, you know, the goddess and the world, essentially. That once you make a choice like that, you are behaving as a god, right? And so I think that is where that comes from, and that we have textual evidence elsewhere that Diana can play with fire, but that witchfire, and particularly the feeling of witchfire as an arrow and as a weapon, is a very particularized feeling that we only deal with a couple times.
And I do like the huntress imagery with the bow and the arrow that we're definitely going to revisit in this book and in this series. And I just think it's interesting if this is the most powerful element, and if you're behaving, and if it is irrevocable, you know, her wielding it against her aunt, to me kind of speaks to like a deeper, like this fraught relationship that she has with her family and with her aunts at this point, and this like emotional state that she is in, that she is able to wield this like incredibly powerful and also final element against her family.
Yeah, she's absolutely wrecked, you know, and that she's really at this moment kind of unhinged. I do like the moment where Matthew says, "I had hoped the witchfire would be recessive."
It's very funny. Like there's all these funny moments now that are just like and
it's charming too, because it's like clearly you don't want your partner to like have this weapon that they could break out at any point that you can't fight. I'd hoped it was recessive. No, darling. No, we've noticed that nothing about Diana is recessive.
So far, she has all the things. So
correct. She's
we
the
now
witch's
have
witch.
All four elements accounted for. So, and I do also like since we're talking about humorous things, you know, the humor with all of the ghosts, while Diana is like sparking everywhere and the ghosts are all like, watch the rug, like don't set things on fire. Like, I just think it's so fun. Like we're in this like deep emotional place, and Diana is obviously very distraught and doesn't think it's funny, but like it's funny. It reads funny on the page.
Well, I like the textual representation on 423 and 424 of the conversation that you and I have had several times about whose responsibility was it to tell Diana. Was it Diana's responsibility to look into her magic? Was it Sarah and M's responsibility to tell her? And I think that Sarah's right here in the sense that like she goes back to like Diana didn't come with an instruction manual. She came to us extraordinarily damaged, and we were just trying to keep her with us. She was so closed off that there was nothing we could do. And Sarah coming back to Matthew and being like, this isn't a quick fix. This will take her whole life.
Although I wonder, now that we know that M knew about the spellbinding and Sarah did not, how much more culpable does that make M? And did M really do her best with all of that knowledge? Whereas Sarah had no idea, sure.
But what damage does it also do to Sarah and M's relationship, right? Like, I mean, that's one of the things we don't deal with in this chapter is like what a painful thing it would be for Sarah, for M to have kept this from her for so long. Not only because Rebecca was textually like Sarah's favorite person, but also because M knows this thing that could have explained so much and just never said anything. And I think that goes back to like M's general sort of Anne of Green Gables-ness and detachedness, where she's been kind of like
her willful naivete.
Correct. And looking at the sunny side of things, maybe as a response to her own pain of losing Rebecca. Who knows? I mean, sadly, we don't get as much textually of M and Sarah's interiority as I think I'd like. I would love for the TV series to explore that, because I wonder what this means for M and Sarah.
Well, we have talked a little bit before about how much of their actions with Diana growing up could potentially be as a result of their trauma, and much of their reactions to the congregation and Peter Knox and all of these revelations and kind of their attitude that all witches are good and lovely is a result of their own personal trauma, and that this just might be an extension of that. We get the white table. We get the white table again. We have not had the white table in quite some time.
And Diana resorting to the white table, knowing what it is, choosing the white table, which I think is, well, I mean, the text does say it appears without warning, but she doesn't do anything to stop it. She is sort of allowing these things to pass through her the way that Mart instructed her to, and she's allowing things that she has repressed to come back, which I think it's effective.
And it shows up, you know, like you said, without her asking for it, but then she uses it and she's not afraid of it because it's something that she's familiar with. And she does, I think, get some sort of peace and some answers from in doing that, because she now has enough pieces to put at least this corner of the puzzle together with respect to Stephen and Rebecca and her spellbinding and her life and, you know, Rebecca's stories and all of this. So it's just a tiny little piece of the puzzle that she's now able to complete. Hooray.
But how much more heartbreaking does it make Stephen?
It's so
Rebecca?
sad.
It is so sad. And
it's so tragic.
It also sort of highlights the malevolence of Peter Knox in this like background way, where it appears now that it's no accident that Peter Knox is the one who threatened her at Oxford, or in Oxford, I should say.
Yes, they have met before.
Stephen and Rebecca will just always and forever like shatter me to tiny pieces, because it's so clear from what they did how much they loved their child and how important it was that she survive. Ugh.
I know.
Once we have this discussion of Stephen and Rebecca, we have the part of the chapter that I just find odd from a pacing perspective. And that's because we have spent all of this time dealing with Diana and her healing, and then Matthew takes her out in the woods and essentially begins playing a game of like vampire and witch tag or capture the flag in the woods. And I just think that it's a weird thing to do when your partner has just come from this extraordinarily traumatic experience, to chase her around the woods in the dark and try and force her into using her power. I find it hard, and I'm not saying that it kicks me out of the book. I'm just like, really, Matthew, now? And the truth is that I think that this is a bit of scaffolding, in the sense that we are at a point in the book where we are speeding into and through sort of Act 3, trying to reach the climax, and the only way that I can sort of rationalize this set of scenes happening where it does, I have no argument about it happening, but happening where it does, is because I think that we are trying to speed towards Act 3 and the climax of this book. I think that there is certainly an argument that we could make that this might be a cleaner story if we dealt with Satu in this book, did a book break, moved on to deal with some other stuff in a second book, then a third, then a fourth. But we can talk about that when we get to our overall structure episode and when we get to our end of series type structure episodes.
I think I fall on the same side as you, where I don't have a problem with it happening, and I could somewhat make the argument for it happening now, because I feel like it's important for Diana to face these things while she has again turned to run away, both physically running away and she's emotionally running away. So I think it is important, and we do have that immediacy with the congregation, whereas like we need her to face up to this and accept who she is. But yes, doing it, you know, a day after she's had all of this trauma and she has these injuries that are still not fully healed, at least the physical ones. Yeah, the timing on that, I'm not sure is wise.
And we certainly have textual evidence from Sarah that Diana retreated when her parents died, and that the place that she goes is a place where no one can reach her. And so I can reasonably accept Matthew saying, I am going to get to her before she has an opportunity to withdraw again, to make sure that she can't react the way that she is programmed to do. And I certainly think that that is a reasonable option as is presented to him. The only thing that I just don't like about it is how soon in time we are to Lapierre textually. And in like the real-time reading, when you look at these things when they happen on a calendar, it's like 2 days. And that just seems like not enough time.
And, you know, not to mention, like, she just wielded Witchfire in the kitchen. And so for all Matthew knows, like, she's just going to light him up like a bonfire. That's the emotional state she's in right now.
Right. This is not the best time to pick a fight.
Yes. While I agree with the whole relying on instincts and, all of that stuff and putting her in a place where she has to rely on her instincts, like, buddy, this could go real bad for you.
Right. It is not Matthew's best judgment, but as we know, he's not always the best planner when he is upset.
Perhaps he's fangry again.
Hashtag fangry. Thank you, Kim. I do like what it does for Diana's magic here. The only thing that frustrates me about what it does for Diana's magic is that we do this and this like incredible fount of potential is released, and then frankly, like, we don't play with it again for quite some time.
Right. It kind of stalls. Like, she can do all the things. It kind of
stalls.
And is very competent, and then we kind of go backwards a bit after this. Like, no spoilers for the next reading, but
I think I'm going to spend some time, like, textually looking for a reason for that. And it could just be because, like, she is not nearly as open in the end of this book as she was in this moment, where it's really only Sarah and Em and Matthew and Diana and Tabitha. And that she's not as open to these possibilities. And a lot of other things happen where she's just not processing very well. But I do like what it does for Diana's magic, and I do like what it does for their partnership, where, she draws even with him and sort of confronts him on her terms, which I think is a really lovely relationship moment.
Yeah. And I think, too, surprises him a bit, and Matthew is not always surprised. It's not often surprised by things.
Well, that's usually because he just manages them to death, so there are no surprises.
Right. Like, I think, on the theoretical level, he knew that she could be competent and dangerous, but, like, now he's like, oh, she's actually can be competent and dangerous.
Well, and the realization that he'll have to back off for that to be the case. Like, he'll have to give her space to push back against him to be the best version of herself, which I think is a really useful thing for him to realize. That he can be surprised by her, that she is surprising, but also that within her is the capacity to take care of herself if he will only give her the space to do it. I like our family dinner. I like the interactions between Sarah and Matthew over the bottles of wine, and the image of Tabitha curled up like a parrot on Matthew's shoulder I like very, very much. And we go to bed in her parents' bedroom, and the house produces the key, which I think is just a sweet thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, house. Because then there are fireworks.
Fireworks are nice.
Yeah. Thanks, house.
Fireworks are a nice euphemism.
Sure.
We'll go with it. Uh-huh. I hope the carpet's okay.
The bed might be another story, but I'm sure the carpet's fine.
Hey, yo. And that's where we leave our readings. Our next chapters are 30.
Mm-hmm. It's a nice, happy, comfortable place.
It is, and safe. And safe in a way that, to me, Septur did not feel safe, I think because of the presence of Isabeau. But it definitely feels like we are in safe, good territory before we get into chapters 34, 35, and 36, which we will talk about in our next episode.
Yes, indeed. And thank you all for listening. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at Chamomile in Clove. You can email us with your thoughts, which we love receiving emails about, or at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com. And you can also look us up on our website and find our episodes and reading schedule and all of our real-time reading things if you want to reread some of those items. And we will speak to you all next time.
For sure. And when we speak to you next time, as I said, we'd be covering 34, 35, and 36. The episode after that, 37, 38, 39. And then 3 episodes from now, we have 39, 40, 41, and probably 42, because that is the end of the book. And we'll do 4 chapters then. So our question is, before we get started with our reading for Shadow of Night, I think that we would be interested to hear from you about what kinds of conversations you'd like to have about A Discovery of Witches as a whole, and what kinds of themes you'd like us to discuss. We had talked about talking some structure stuff, some overall character stuff, like how the character arcs work in this book, but there are lots of other things that we could start talking about, and we would love some topic suggestions for some wrap-up episodes. So you could send those to chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com. You can direct message us on Twitter at ChamomileInNovemberClove, and you can send those to us, and we'd be interested to see what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. We're nearing the end of the book. It's amazing.
I don't know how that happened.
We just passed the halfway point.
For sure.
All right.
For sure.
Well, I think that's it. All right.
Thank you very much for listening. We love having you, and we hope to hear from you in between now and our next episode. So thank you very much, and good night.
Yes, thank you. Bye.